Have you ever watched a man burn down his own life, then point at the ashes and blame you? My name is Rachel. I was 31 when Nathan decided being a husband and father was too heavy for him. Our boys were tiny then, 5 and 3, still young enough to run to the door when they heard his truck, still innocent enough to believe every broken promise was just delayed, not abandoned. Nathan had a stable government recruiting job, good pay, benefits, respect, and the kind of uniform that made strangers assume he was honorable. I was mostly home with the boys, picking up freelance work whenever I could. Some months I helped with groceries. Some months I barely covered diapers. Still, I believed we were building something. Then a teenage girl sent me a message online. She asked, "Are you and Nathan really separated?" I read it 3 times before my body understood what my eyes already knew. Nathan had been partying with young recruits, chasing the life he claimed our family had stolen from him, and sleeping with someone barely older than a child. She did not even know the truth. He had made her another victim of his lies. When I confronted him, I expected shame. I expected panic. I expected some cracked apology. Instead, he got angry. He said I had ruined his 20s. He said the children had tied him down. He said every dream he had lost was somehow my fault, as if I had forced him to marry me, forced him to become a father, forced him to betray us. A few weeks later, he came home drunk. The boys were asleep. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and his boots dragging across the floor. He looked at me with no love left in his face and said, "Take the kids and get out." That was it. No plan. No money. No concern for where his sons would sleep. Just a command, like we were furniture he no longer wanted in his house. I wanted to scream, but screaming would not feed my children. Crying would not pay rent. So I stood there, shaking, and made a decision he did not see. I would leave, but I would not disappear. I called a long-time freelance client and told the truth, humiliating as it was. She loaned me enough money to secure a small place. I packed quietly. I smiled when I had to. I protected the boys from the worst of it. Nathan thought he was getting freedom. He thought he was removing responsibility from his life. What he did not understand was that responsibility has a way of finding the people who run from it. And before long, the same system he wore proudly on his chest would turn around, reach into his paycheck, and teach him a lesson he never saw coming. That was the first crack in his empire. Welcome to dramatic revenge. Moving out of that house felt like carrying a mountain on my back. Every box I packed reminded me of the life I thought I had. Every toy I wrapped belonged to a child who still believed his father loved him. Every dish, blanket, and photo frame felt like evidence from a crime scene. Nathan, meanwhile, acted like he had won. The more stressed I became, the happier he seemed. He strutted around the house with a confidence that only comes from believing there will never be consequences. He spent his evenings drinking, going out, and acting like he was finally free. What bothered me most wasn't that he wanted out of the marriage. It was how little he cared about what happened to his children afterward. I spent my days calling landlords, balancing bills, and figuring out how to stretch every dollar. Nathan spent his days pretending he had no responsibilities. Eventually, I secured a small rental. It wasn't fancy. The carpets were old. The kitchen was tiny. The neighborhood wasn't exactly what I had dreamed of. But it was safe. And safe was enough. As moving day approached, I realized I was still short on money. Deposits, utility transfers, food, gas. Everything cost more than I expected. Then my eyes landed on Nathan's hunting room. It was packed. Rifles, scopes, camping equipment, hunting jackets, accessories. Years of expensive hobbies stacked neatly against the walls. Nathan loved that room more than some people love their families. An idea formed in my head. The night before moving day, after checking local laws and making sure I wasn't crossing any lines, I listed a large portion of the equipment online. I priced everything aggressively. Very aggressively. By morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. People showed up one after another. Cash changed hands. Boxes disappeared. Within a few hours, most of the equipment was gone. I walked away with a little over $1,000. To some people, that might not seem like much. To me, it felt like oxygen. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my future. The best part came later. Nathan arrived home and immediately noticed the empty shelves. At first he looked confused, then concerned, then furious. The yelling started almost instantly. He demanded to know what happened. He demanded to know where everything went. He demanded to know who gave me permission. I simply reminded him that he had ordered me and the children out of the house. Moving costs money. And suddenly he wasn't laughing anymore. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not guilt, not regret, fear. A small amount, but definitely fear. Because deep down, Nathan had expected me to collapse. He expected me to beg. He expected me to fail. Instead, I was adapting, surviving, building a way forward without him. What neither of us knew was that this little victory would soon be overshadowed by something much bigger. Because while Nathan was busy mourning his hunting gear, a government liaison was reviewing his file. And that man was about to change Nathan's financial future forever. A few weeks after the boys and I settled into our little rental, reality finally had a chance to catch up with me. The adrenaline that had carried me through the move began to fade. The boxes were unpacked. The children were adjusting. Life was starting to look normal on the surface. But every night after they fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table staring at bills. Rent, utilities, groceries, school expenses, gas. Everything added up faster than I could earn it. I had freelance clients and a growing workload, but nothing about my income felt stable. Some months were decent. Some months were terrifying. I knew I needed help. The problem was that asking for help felt like admitting defeat. Nathan had spent months convincing me that I was the burden, the failure, the reason everything had fallen apart. Part of me still believed it. Still, my children deserved better than my pride. So I scheduled a meeting with a government family support liaison connected to Nathan's employer. I walked into that office expecting paperwork, delays, and disappointment. Instead, I met an older man who looked like he had spent decades dealing with people exactly like Nathan. He listened quietly while I explained the situation. The cheating, the abandonment, the children, the financial struggles. When I finished, I said something that immediately changed his expression. "I don't really want anything from Nathan," I told him. "I just want to move on." The man stared at me for several seconds. Then he leaned back in his chair. "Young lady," he said, "that's not how this works." I remember feeling confused. He continued, "Those children didn't create themselves." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. For the first time since this nightmare started, someone was speaking plainly. Someone was refusing to excuse Nathan's behavior. The liaison explained that Nathan's employer took family abandonment seriously. Very seriously. Employees couldn't simply walk away from their spouses and children without consequences. There were regulations, reviews, investigations, financial obligations. And if those obligations weren't met voluntarily, there were mechanisms to ensure they were met anyway. Nathan apparently had no idea. The liaison processed the paperwork. He explained the next steps. Then he told me something that nearly made me fall out of my chair. Temporary support payments would begin while the larger legal process moved forward. $1,000 per month. Every month. Directly from Nathan's paycheck. I honestly thought I had misheard him. $1,000 felt enormous at the time. Not because it would make us rich. Because it would allow us to breathe. I left that office feeling lighter than I had in years. Meanwhile, Nathan was having a very different day. The moment the deductions appeared, he exploded. Phone calls, messages, voicemails, accusations, threats. According to Nathan, I was destroying his life. Again, it didn't matter that he had abandoned his family. It didn't matter that his children needed food, clothes, and shelter. In Nathan's mind, the only tragedy was that money was leaving his account. The irony was almost funny. If he had simply supported his children willingly, none of this would have happened. Instead, he forced the system to get involved. And unlike me, the system didn't care about his excuses. The first deduction was painful for him. The second was worse. The third convinced him I wasn't going away. What Nathan still didn't realize was that this was only the beginning. Because while he was busy complaining about child support, the financial house of cards he had built around himself was already starting to collapse. And soon, he would discover that losing $1,000 a month was nothing compared to what was coming next. By the time the divorce proceedings began, I thought I had seen the worst of Nathan. I was wrong. There is something dangerous about a person who spends years planning their escape while pretending everything is normal. Looking back, I realized Nathan hadn't suddenly decided to leave. He had been preparing for it for a long time. The evidence was everywhere. I just hadn't known what I was looking at. During one of our divorce meetings, Nathan revealed a secret he had been keeping for years. The house wasn't jointly owned. The truck wasn't jointly owned. Neither was anything else of significant value. Everything was in his name. Everything. I remember sitting there in stunned silence as he explained it. Years earlier, I had asked whether my name needed to be added to certain documents. Nathan had laughed and told me married couples automatically shared ownership. He acted like I was worrying over nothing. And like an idiot, I believed him. Now he sat there looking incredibly pleased with himself. He wasn't even trying to hide it. There was a smugness in his voice that made my stomach turn. For years, he had quietly arranged things so that if the marriage ended, I would walk away with as little as possible. The realization hurt. Not because of the money, because it proved how long he had been planning for failure. While I thought we were building a future together, he had been building an exit strategy. Nathan expected me to break down. He expected tears, anger, begging, something. Instead, I surprised both of us. I shrugged. The truth was, by that point, I was exhausted. The house no longer felt like home. The truck no longer felt like security. They were simply things. And unlike Nathan, I had learned that things can disappear. Character is harder to replace. Still, Nathan treated his victory like a championship trophy. For weeks afterward, he bragged about keeping everything. Friends heard about it. Family heard about it. Apparently, he loved telling people how smart he had been. Then reality arrived. The problem with owning everything is that you're responsible for everything. Mortgage payments, vehicle payments, insurance, maintenance, taxes. Nathan had spent years enjoying ownership. Now he had to carry its weight alone. And Nathan wasn't nearly as financially responsible as he pretended to be. Within months, the cracks started showing. Bills piled up. Payments were missed. Collections notices arrived. At first, he managed to hide it. Then things became impossible to ignore. The truck was repossessed. I still remember hearing about it through a mutual acquaintance. At first, I thought it was a rumor. Then I learned it was true. Nathan's prized vehicle had been taken. Not long afterward, the house followed the same path. The mortgage fell behind. The bank stepped in. And eventually, the property was gone. The same house Nathan had fought so hard to keep became the very thing that dragged him down. The irony was almost unbelievable. He had spent years making sure I couldn't claim half. Then he lost 100% of it. Meanwhile, my little rental remained untouched. No repossessions. No foreclosure notices. No creditors calling. No property to lose. For the first time since our separation, I understood something important. Nathan wasn't succeeding while I struggled. He was simply failing more slowly. And that failure was accelerating. Before long, the financial pressure became so severe that bankruptcy entered the picture. The man who had once acted untouchable was suddenly drowning in debt. But even then, Nathan refused to take responsibility. Nothing was ever his fault. Not the cheating. Not the divorce. Not the lost house. Not the repossessed truck. And certainly not the bankruptcy. According to him, every disaster could be traced back to one person. Me. Unfortunately for Nathan, life wasn't finished teaching him lessons. The worst mistake of his entire life was still ahead of him. And this time, it wouldn't involve money. It would involve our children. By the time Nathan's financial situation started falling apart, my life was finally beginning to stabilize. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but steadily. The boys and I had settled into a routine. The little rental that once felt temporary had become a home. I had built my freelance work into something reliable enough to pay the bills. And for the first time since the separation, I could look more than a month ahead without feeling sick with anxiety. The boys were thriving too. They had friends. They were doing well in school. They laughed more. Most importantly, they no longer spent every day wondering when their father was coming back. Children have a heartbreaking ability to adapt to disappointment. Eventually, they stop expecting things that never arrive. Nathan, meanwhile, drifted in and out of their lives. Sometimes he would call. Sometimes he wouldn't. Sometimes he'd promise to visit. Usually he didn't. Every excuse sounded different, but they all meant the same thing. The boys weren't his priority. I had finally accepted that reality when everything exploded. It happened on what should have been a completely ordinary school day. I was finishing work when my phone rang. The school. At first, I assumed someone was sick. Instead, the secretary sounded confused. Your boys were picked up earlier. My stomach immediately tightened. Picked up by who? There was a pause. By their father. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Nathan rarely showed up unexpectedly. He certainly never picked them up from school without notice. I called his phone immediately. No answer. I called again. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. I drove home praying there was some innocent explanation. Maybe he'd decided to surprise them. Maybe he forgot to tell me. Maybe there was some misunderstanding. The moment I pulled into my driveway, I knew something was wrong. The boys weren't there. Hours passed. Then the evening. Then the night. No children. No explanation. No contact. Nothing. I barely slept. The next morning I started making calls. By the afternoon, panic had fully taken over. Nathan finally responded with a message that made my blood run cold. According to him, he had taken the boys to protect them from me. Protect them. From me. The woman who had raised them largely alone. The woman who attended every school meeting, every doctor's appointment, every baseball practice. The woman who worked herself to exhaustion to keep food on the table. Apparently, I was now the danger. The accusation would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. Then something else occurred to me. Almost immediately after taking the boys, Nathan stopped paying child support. Suddenly, the timing looked very convenient. He wasn't rescuing anyone. He was trying to escape responsibility. I hired a lawyer that same week. Not because I could afford it, because I couldn't afford not to. Every hour felt unbearable. Every day without knowing where my children were felt like a year. Eventually, my attorney recommended hiring a private investigator. The cost made me sick. Thousands of dollars I didn't have. Thousands of dollars that could have gone toward the boys' future. But none of that mattered if I couldn't bring them home. The investigator worked quickly. Unlike Nathan, he understood that people almost always leave trails. Phone records, addresses, friends, family. Eventually those trails led somewhere. And when we finally discovered where Nathan had taken my sons, I felt two emotions simultaneously. Relief and rage. Because this wasn't some desperate father trying to protect his children. This was a selfish man using his own sons as pawns in a battle he had created. The moment we located them, my attorney began preparing emergency custody paperwork. Court dates were scheduled. Evidence was gathered. Statements were collected. Nathan seemed convinced he was about to expose some grand secret about my supposed neglect. What he didn't realize was that lies sound convincing only until they're forced to stand beside facts. And very soon, a judge would get to hear both. The weeks leading up to the custody hearing were some of the most exhausting of my life. People often imagine that once you find your children, the nightmare is over. It isn't. Finding them was only the first battle. Now I had to prove something that should never have needed proving in the first place, that I was a fit mother. Every document in my house suddenly became evidence. School records, medical records, report cards, attendance reports, receipts, emails, photos. Years of ordinary parenting were gathered into folders and organized for strangers to examine. Meanwhile, Nathan seemed incredibly confident. According to mutual acquaintances, he was telling anyone who would listen that he was finally going to expose me. He claimed he had rescued the boys from a terrible environment. He painted himself as a devoted father who had stepped in when no one else would. The stories became more dramatic each time they were repeated. The strange thing was that none of them resembled reality. Nathan had never attended most school meetings. He rarely called the boys consistently. He missed birthdays. He missed sporting events. He missed countless opportunities to be present. Yet somehow, he expected everyone to believe he had suddenly become Father of the Year. What concerned me most was that he had managed to find a lawyer willing to represent him. The attorney worked with veterans and often took cases at reduced rates or pro bono. At first, I worried that Nathan had convinced him. Nathan was charismatic when he wanted to be. He knew how to present himself as the victim. For several days, I imagined worst-case scenarios. Then something unexpected happened. My lawyer began speaking with Nathan's attorney. Documents were exchanged. Evidence was reviewed. Questions were asked. And little by little, the picture Nathan had painted started falling apart. The allegations didn't match the records. The accusations didn't match the evidence. The timeline didn't make sense. One by one, the holes became impossible to ignore. Then communication from Nathan's attorney suddenly slowed down. Emails took longer to receive responses. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. At first, everyone assumed he was simply busy. Then it became obvious something else was happening. My attorney eventually managed to reach him and later called me with an update. The conversation was almost funny. Apparently, Nathan's lawyer sounded completely exhausted. Gone was the enthusiasm of someone fighting for a righteous cause. Gone was the determination to expose wrongdoing. Instead, he sounded like a man who had realized he had been handed a pile of nonsense. The way my attorney described it, the lawyer's attitude was essentially, "Do whatever needs to be done. I have more important things to worry about." That was the moment I knew Nathan's case was collapsing. Even so, I remained nervous until the actual hearing. Courtrooms have a way of making everyone anxious, even when they're telling the truth. When the day finally arrived, Nathan looked irritated more than confident. His attorney looked tired. Very tired. My lawyer looked prepared. The judge reviewed the evidence. The records. The timelines. The communication history. The children's circumstances. And then came the decision. I was granted full physical custody. Nathan was given visitation rights every other weekend. The arrangement was fair. More than fair, honestly. Despite everything he had done, the court still gave him the opportunity to remain involved in his sons' lives. You would think someone who claimed to have rescued his children would be thrilled. You would think someone who fought so hard for custody would immediately start exercising those visitation rights. But that's not what happened. The weekends came and went. Nathan rarely showed up. Sometimes he canceled. Sometimes he simply disappeared. Sometimes he blamed work. Sometimes he blamed money. There was always an excuse. Never accountability. And that was when the final illusion shattered. Because a father who truly wants his children doesn't need to be forced to spend time with them. The truth was painfully simple. Nathan hadn't taken the boys because he loved them more than I did. He had taken them because he wanted control. Once the court removed that control, his interest began fading almost immediately. And while he was busy drifting further away from his sons, I was focused on something very different. Building the life they deserved. After the custody hearing, something unexpected happened. For the first time in years, there was peace. Not complete peace, of course. Nathan still existed. There were still occasional messages, missed visitations, and moments when the boys would ask difficult questions about why their father wasn't around. But the constant chaos that had dominated our lives for so long began to fade. I remember sitting at the kitchen table one evening after the boys had gone to bed and realizing that I wasn't afraid anymore. For years, every decision I made had been influenced by survival. How do I pay rent? How do I keep food in the house? How do I handle another legal bill? How do I protect the boys from whatever Nathan does next? But now, for the first time, I could think beyond survival. I could think about the future. And once I started thinking about the future, everything changed. My freelance business had grown steadily over the years. What had once been unpredictable side work became a reliable source of income. Then it became something more than reliable. I wasn't wealthy. Not even close. But I was comfortable. Comfortable enough to stop checking my bank account 3 times a day. Comfortable enough to start planning instead of reacting. The first thing I did was move us into a better neighborhood. Nothing extravagant. Just safer streets. Better schools. More opportunities. The boys were old enough to notice the difference immediately. They made friends quickly. They rode their bikes around the neighborhood. They joined local activities. For the first time, they were getting to experience childhood without constantly feeling the tension of adult problems hanging over them. I also invested heavily in their education. One of my sons struggled with certain learning challenges and needed extra academic support. For years, I had worried about how I would afford specialized tutoring. Now I could finally provide it. The tutoring wasn't cheap, not even remotely. Between both boys, I was spending hundreds of dollars every month. But every time I saw their grades improve, every time I watched their confidence grow, it felt worth every penny. Then came music lessons, art classes, sports teams, baseball equipment, school trips, birthday parties, all the little things that make childhood memorable. The things that had once felt impossible. People sometimes assume child support is some kind of jackpot. Anyone who has actually raised children knows better. Kids are expensive. Growing kids are even more expensive. Every few months, they seem to outgrow their clothes. Shoes needed replacing. Sports equipment needed upgrading. School expenses appeared constantly. There was always something. And yet, despite all those expenses, I found myself in a position I never expected. I didn't need Nathan's money anymore. Not the way I once had. The support payments helped, certainly, but our survival no longer depended on them. That realization changed the way I viewed him. For years, I had been angry, then hurt, then exhausted. Now, mostly, I felt indifferent, which surprised me, because indifference is often the opposite of love, not hate. I simply stopped expecting anything from him. Unfortunately, that indifference led me to make a mistake. A big one. I started feeling sorry for him. Nathan's financial situation continued deteriorating. I heard rumors about debts, job struggles, and constant complaints about money. Every update painted the picture of a man who couldn't seem to get out of his own way. Instead of seeing those problems as the consequences of his choices, I felt sympathy. Maybe too much sympathy. At some point, I stopped aggressively pursuing child support adjustments that I was legally entitled to seek. I told myself I didn't need the money. I told myself he was struggling. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. Looking back, I realized I was making excuses for him again. The same way I had during our marriage. The same way I had for years. Thankfully, life was about to remind me why that was a mistake. Because Nathan wasn't changing. He wasn't growing. And he certainly wasn't becoming more responsible. In fact, he was quietly preparing for another disappearing act. And this time, I wasn't going to let him get away with it. One of the strangest things about Nathan was his ability to repeat the same mistakes while expecting different results. Years had passed since our divorce. The boys were older, happier, and thriving in ways I once worried would never be possible. They had routines, friends, goals, and a stable home life. Most importantly, they had stopped waiting by the window for a father who rarely showed up. Nathan, meanwhile, seemed trapped in a cycle of his own making. Every few months, I would hear about a new problem. A new complaint, a new reason why nothing in his life was working out. Somehow every setback was always someone else's fault. His employer, his ex-wife, the economy, bad luck, anyone except the man staring back at him in the mirror. Then I learned he had rejoined government service in a different branch. The moment I heard that news, I contacted the child support office. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I needed the money, because our children were entitled to support from both parents. And I was finally done making excuses for him. The paperwork moved forward. Almost immediately, Nathan began acting strangely. Phone calls stopped being returned. Messages went unanswered. Emails disappeared into silence. It was obvious what he was doing. He thought if he ignored the process long enough, it might somehow go away. Unfortunately for him, legal obligations don't disappear simply because someone refuses to answer their phone. Then came an unexpected phone call from his parents. They were upset, very upset. At first, I assumed they were calling about the child support case. Instead, they accused me of keeping their grandchildren away from them. I was genuinely confused. As far as I knew, they had always been welcome to see the boys. I told them exactly that. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then the conversation shifted. Over the following weeks, they began visiting more often. The boys enjoyed spending time with them, and to their credit, Nathan's parents genuinely loved their grandsons. Unlike Nathan, they made an effort. During one visit, we were sitting in the backyard watching the boys play when I casually asked a question. "Is Nathan coming home for the holidays this year?" His mother answered without hesitation. "Oh yes, he'll be staying with us." She even mentioned the address where he'd be spending the holiday break. I don't think she realized the significance of what she had just told me. I certainly didn't react. I smiled, changed the subject, kept the conversation moving. But the moment they left, I made a phone call. The child support office had been struggling to locate Nathan for service. He wasn't exactly cooperating. Now I had exactly what they needed. An address, a date, and confirmation that he would be there. I provided the information and went about my life. A few weeks later, I received a call from a caseworker who sounded like she was trying not to laugh. Apparently, Nathan had been served with child support papers while visiting his parents for the holidays. The image was almost too perfect. I imagined him relaxing, enjoying the holiday, believing he had successfully dodged responsibility yet again. Then a knock at the door. A deputy standing there, legal documents in hand. No escape. No excuses. No disappearing act. Just consequences arriving right on schedule. Nathan was furious. According to several people, he spent days ranting about it. He told anyone who would listen that he was going to hire a lawyer. He was going to fight. He was going to win. He was going to prove once and for all that I couldn't control him. The funny thing was that I wasn't trying to control him. I was simply asking him to do what he should have been doing all along. Support his children. What happened next would prove that Nathan's biggest enemy had never been me. It was his own pride. When Nathan called after being served, he sounded exactly the way I expected. Angry. Not worried. Not reflective. Not embarrassed. Just angry. The strange thing about Nathan was that he always seemed to believe every conflict was a competition. There always had to be a winner and a loser. A compromise wasn't a solution to him. It was surrender. That mindset had already cost him a marriage, a home, a vehicle, and a relationship with his children. Now it was about to cost him a lot more money. The first few minutes of the conversation were predictable. He accused me of trying to ruin his life. Again, he accused me of being greedy. Again, he accused me of caring more about money than family. Again, I listened quietly. Years earlier, those accusations would have hurt me. I would have defended myself. I would have tried to explain my side of things. But after everything that had happened, I finally understood something important. People like Nathan don't argue to understand. They argue to avoid responsibility. Nothing I said was going to change his mind. So I let him talk. Eventually, he stopped long enough for me to respond. And when I did, I made him an offer. A reasonable one. At that point, based on his income and the calculations involved, I had grounds to pursue roughly $1,000 per month in support. Instead, I offered to settle for $700. Not because I had to, because I was trying to be fair. The boys were older now. My financial situation was stable. I wasn't looking to punish him. I simply wanted him to contribute consistently. For a moment, I genuinely thought he might accept. Most people would have. Most people would recognize a good deal when it was sitting directly in front of them. Nathan wasn't most people. There was a pause on the phone. Then he laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not an uncertain one. A smug laugh. The kind of laugh someone makes when they think they're about to outsmart you. "If you think I'm agreeing to that, you're crazy," he said. Then came the line I will never forget. "We'll let the lawyers figure it out." I almost smiled when he said it. Not because I knew exactly what would happen. Because I knew exactly who Nathan was. His need to win had always been stronger than his common sense. A week later, I received a call from my caseworker. I expected an update. Maybe another delay. Maybe another round of negotiations. Instead, she sounded amused. "You're not going to believe this," she said. I immediately sat up straighter. What happened? There was a brief pause. Then she told me. Nathan had agreed to the full amount. $1,000 per month. I actually laughed out loud. Not because I was celebrating. Because the situation was so absurd. The man who rejected $700 had somehow managed to negotiate himself into paying $1,000. But the story didn't end there. The caseworker continued explaining the details. As part of the final calculations, Nathan would also be responsible for back support. Years of it. The amount wasn't insignificant. In fact, it was substantial enough that a payment plan would be required. I remember ending the call and simply staring at the wall for several seconds. Nathan had been offered an exit, a reasonable compromise, a chance to save himself hundreds of dollars every month. Instead, his ego convinced him he could do better. And once again, Nathan had succeeded in accomplishing the exact opposite of what he wanted. The truly incredible part was that he still blamed me. Not his lawyer. Not his decisions. Not his pride. Me. As if I had somehow forced him to reject the deal. As if I had personally made him choose the more expensive option. But the consequences were finally catching up. And this time, they were arriving with receipts. 2 years have passed since Nathan decided to let the lawyers figure it out. Ironically, they did. Just not in the way he imagined. Today, Nathan pays approximately $1,200 every month. Part of that amount covers his current child support obligation. The rest goes toward the years of back support he accumulated by avoiding responsibilities he should have been handling from the beginning. Every time I think about it, I'm reminded of how differently things could have turned out. If Nathan had supported his children voluntarily, there would have been no intervention. If he had accepted the $700 settlement, he would have saved himself hundreds of dollars every month. If he had consistently exercised his visitation rights, he might have built meaningful relationships with his sons. If he had taken responsibility for even a fraction of his choices, his life would probably look very different today. But Nathan never seemed interested in responsibility. He was interested in winning. And that's the problem with treating life like a competition. Eventually, you become so focused on defeating other people that you don't realize you're defeating yourself. Even now, Nathan continues telling anyone who will listen that I ruined him financially. According to him, I am the reason he struggles. I am the reason he can't get ahead. I am the reason he's broke. What he never mentions is the years I spent raising our sons largely on my own. He never talks about the nights I stayed awake worrying about rent. He never mentions the food stamps, the second jobs, the freelance work, the sacrifices, the birthdays I paid for, the school supplies I bought, the sports fees, the tutoring sessions, the doctor's appointments, the endless expenses that come with raising children. People who have never raised kids often underestimate how expensive parenthood really is. Children don't stop needing things because one parent decides to disappear. They still need clothes. They still need food. They still need shoes every time they outgrow the last pair. They still need opportunities, experiences, support, guidance, love. One of my sons needed specialized tutoring because of a learning disability. Those sessions alone cost hundreds of dollars. Sports became more expensive as they grew older. School activities increased. Everything increased. The support payments helped, but they never came close to covering everything. And honestly, that was never the point. The point was accountability. The point was that children deserve support from both parents. Today, my sons are doing well. They're kind, responsible, hardworking. They have goals, dreams, confidence. Most importantly, they know they are loved. Not because of money, because of consistency, because someone showed up. Nathan's parents remain involved in their lives, and for that, I am genuinely grateful. They love their grandsons deeply, and the boys adore them. In many ways, they became the stable grandparents every child deserves. What always stayed with me, though, was Nathan's father. He had been raised by a single mother after his own father abandoned the family. Because of that experience, he felt strongly about fathers fulfilling their responsibilities. Very strongly. Over the years, I learned that he had repeatedly confronted Nathan about his behavior. Repeatedly. Again and again. And every time I heard about those conversations, I couldn't help thinking about the irony. Of all the consequences Nathan faced, bankruptcy, repossessions, legal battles, child support payments, the one that probably hurt the most was knowing his own father was disappointed in him. Not because he lost money. Not because he lost arguments. Because he became the kind of man his father spent a lifetime trying not to be. In the end, karma didn't arrive in a dramatic flash. It arrived through consequences. One decision at a time. One excuse at a time. One act of selfishness at a time. Nathan spent years running from responsibility. Eventually, responsibility stopped chasing him. It simply waited at the finish line. And when he finally got there, it was still standing exactly where he left it. The biggest mistake a person can make is believing they can avoid responsibility forever. Lies may buy time. Pride may delay consequences. Excuses may convince other people for a while. But eventually, every choice creates a bill that must be paid. True success is not measured by how much money you keep, how many arguments you win, or how many people you blame. It is measured by the responsibilities you honor when nobody forces you to. A parent who shows up, provides support, and puts their children first will always be richer than someone who spends a lifetime running from their obligations. Because karma is rarely revenge. More often, it is simply the natural result of our own decisions coming back to meet us.